have a question for you. What do you think about nation states in this game?
So it's funny. I was actually talking with some folks at the Geotech Center at the Atlantic Council about this the other night. And I have this feeling that there's sort of a parallel universe that's been created already that we don't really talk about, although we do talk about it some. So for me, it's not like a question of do we have nation states or do we not, right? Although nation states aren't that old, they've only existed for a few hundred years, really, right? So it's not like, oh, we've always had countries, we always will. It's like, no, it's not really how the world worked for the vast majority of human existence. But, the status quo is hard to change radically overnight, so we probably have them for a while. But in my mind, there are all these interesting examples where we're creating these layers where, okay, I'm a citizen of a country, but maybe I opt into a global group that helps me access education. I become a citizen of this group. I have certain responsibilities to that group. Maybe it's taxes. Maybe it's I have to contribute a certain kind of labor. Maybe I have to contribute a certain kind of access to compute on my system. I mean, whatever, right? There are a lot of ways you can imagine paying in to your citizenship. And then I get out of that free access to certifications and education in certain areas or something. I can imagine doing that actually with healthcare. So interestingly, I've been looking at alternative approaches to healthcare, and I'm looking now at a concierge medicine group and a health shares group where you're completely out of the system and you have access within 24 hours to your doctor. You pay in a certain amount. It's much cheaper than health insurance. But everything is basically covered and my actual access to care is much higher. But you're basically buying into a community, and once you have a critical mass of the community, it's self-sustaining. So in my mind, there are so many examples of this that are beginning to be created where, okay, government, I pay my taxes, but you're not really giving me all the needs I have for education, for healthcare, for some of these other things that are essential to me. Maybe clean food is another one, right? We see a lot of co-ops being created. When does there come a point when some of these alternatives begin to be bundled into just join us? And I'm suddenly opting out for 50% of my life to a group that's separate from the country I reside in. I appreciate that nation states will try to destroy this and they will drive to a more authoritarian edge to disallow this type of thing to be disruptive for their tax bases. I appreciate this as just the way of control and power and humans. But I am definitely not a believer, as some people who argued vehemently against my somewhat, although I don't find this to be a controversial opinion, but apparently it is in some circles. I just don't think the nation state is as robust of a structure as we would like to believe over time.
Well, it's not so robust. And is it because it has lost a lot of its functions and isn't sort of delivering? Or is it because this decentralizing force of science and technology and other things happening are just giving us, more options? I mean, is it a former or the latter?
I mean, maybe it's both. I think look at the continent of Africa and how unstable this concept of nation states has been there, right? Because communities, whether they're tribal communities, religious communities, have really provided for people. They've been the source of kind of stability and access to resources and basic human needs for, thousands of years, right? And so this idea that we placed arbitrary nation states on top of it that did not, in fact, do a good job providing those needs as a replacement for the communities that they were formerly aligned to shows why it doesn't work, right? I think what's interesting is nation states in wealthier countries, I think, were very robust because the state could actually pick up and support a lot of these needs that people had. That being said, I don't see a reason why the nation state, I don't see a reason why we just assume the nation state stays. We have very good examples in the world of boundaries not being sort of stable and reasonable. And so I guess
part of the discussion is that people have a hard time imagining what then, because they're looking at networks, and they're looking at networks today, and they're thinking they're so fleeting and they can't support, they're not an organizational structure I can trust. Even if they look at regions, they're sort of thinking, yeah, there's regions like in Europe, for instance, right? There's discussion of regionalism, but many of those regions are fairly small and would have a really hard time, certainly outside of the EU, but even inside of the EU, they would require a lot of support in order to basically provide those basic functions and be a functioning economy to its citizens. So, but what you seem to have in mind is an organizational partnership type approach with an alliance between, I guess, various players, which I have at least come to think that we need when it comes to issues such as digitalization, right? Because it's not enough anymore to just talk about general interoperability and like standards bodies and stuff. Because, I wanted to ask you about this. There's so much discussion now about should we regulate algorithms? And then, the idea is, oh no, let's not do that because it's too complicated. But the alternative to regulating algorithms, what is that really? We're not going to have some sort of agreement about what's going to be the principles running our world? I mean, are you going to abdicate? So at some point, whether it's governments or it is kind of a stakeholder governance concept of a bunch of different entities, somebody has to weigh in, right?
So it's interesting. I do think in technology specifically, and when we really think about networks and artificial intelligence and some of these other kind of digital technologies, it's more interesting in that these have a very rapid pace of refresh, right? They're changing at a much more rapid rate because it's low capitalization. It's not like kind of big hardware where you have to build another big prototype and test it. It's really just fast and easy to test and refresh. I do think that the idea that governments, especially democratic governments that rely on kind of conversation and consensus, right, to make decisions about technologies that they don't understand at the pace of the technology. Like, I don't really feel like federal policy is a viable structure as your sole source of governance for something like the internet. And I do feel like having actual groups of people, as elitist as it likely becomes and sounds, right, who actually know how it works, getting together and really proposing ways to go forward is important. Now, thinking about inclusivity and making sure that you don't have an incredible amount of bias that gets baked into that because you lack diversity on those panels of all kinds, right? Experience and ethnicity and gender and all kinds of diversity is problematic. I mean, in my mind, this isn't something that people are going to make a decision about. The government's going to say, that's our job, don't do that. Other people are going to say, you're not doing your job, so we're going to take it into our own hands. We're going to have these sort of interesting parallel universes that arise. And then like something happens, right? My biggest concern, and I've heard this talked about more in the conspiracy theory community than maybe in the mainstream, but I think even in the mainstream, you're hearing more of it now, is that if we aren't careful, we're going to wind up with a quote unquote internet that's like the US internet, the China internet, the EU internet, right? Because we're all going to want our own rules. It's not even just an authoritarianism problem, right? It's like, I want my privacy rules and my data rules and my transparency rules. And we finally came up with our own, and it took us a long time to do it. So now, unless you play by our rules, you don't come into our country. And then there are going to be these groups that are like, this is not what the internet was supposed to be. And they're going to be figuring out ways to create pipes across these islands, right? And to me, that's a metaphor for nation states and these kind of parallel organizations that are likely going to be created around all kinds of things. Is that I don't know where that ends. It's probably not somewhere. It's not somewhere where the journey to that destination is a happy one or a pleasant one. There's probably a lot of fighting along the way. But I don't see how we can sustain the path we're on with this very slow governance process that's relatively lacking in education, being layered on top of the pace of technological development that actually impacts citizens in their homes, being so disconnected. So I don't know that I don't have an answer for you. I guess I know I don't have an answer for you. I have an imagination of that future that's not the future I'd like. And so I work with places like the Geotech Center because I'd like to believe that smart, caring people getting together and talking across borders and across disciplines can at least try to find ways to make sure that the pipes exist, if not the whole internet.
So let's look at the big alternatives. I mean, is the alternative a global constitutional convention, finally, to say, like the founding fathers that you started this conversation with, that, we are really worried about who is ruling us. We don't think it's fair, but it has to be a global situation? Or will there be these parallel tracks with many sort of topic-based organizations where, one is dealing with technology and one is dealing with food supply, and also, will these be geographically based, do you think, or are they just overlapping partnerships that have nothing to do neither with geography, which is very embedded in the nation state concept, nor are they going to be global because perhaps that's just too ambitious?
Yeah, I mean, I think the global thing is just, it's really hard when we don't have agreement and we have a rising sort of bilateral power standoff between pretty fundamental values of openness, transparency, the role of the citizen, the role of the government in relation to their citizens. And so I think, we talk a lot about like rising authoritarianism, et cetera, but for me, these are just fundamentally different viewpoints on the relationship between the citizenry and its government. I don't think you can get a global agreement on sort of value-based things when there are two fundamentally deeply held opposing sets of values, right?
Well, you are assuming that these are shared values in those geographies, but what if they're actually... You're assuming that there's going to be a treaty-based global convention. I was more thinking, what if people just arise and say, beyond the states, let's forget, creating a new United Nations. Let's just rethink it like you started with the founding fathers. They didn't ask anybody's permission. In fact, they said goodbye, kings.
Right, true. Yeah, no, that's a super fascinating perspective. Something I've never actually heard discussed in policy circles. And something I'd
There could be a reason why, I don't know.
But something I'd love to start throwing out, right? It's like, look, people have lost their sense of autonomy, I think, by and large. And there's a lot of frustration. And you see a really different perspective on autonomy in this younger generation, especially, I think, in the US and Europe. I don't have as much direct experience in Asia. So it's super interesting. I also think that the topic-based stuff is just supernatural because people speak a language regardless of what national language they speak, right? There's a technical language or a jargon language in each of these domains that does bind people. And so I do think it's really easy to have these things sort of coalesce around another commonly shared set of not necessarily values, but passions, right? And knowledge base. And so I do think you're going to see a lot of topic-based sort of efforts and pilot programs and work that could benefit a lot from cross-pollination, but probably don't benefit much from that in the early stages while they're just trying to figure out what works and what doesn't work. So I don't actually think it's bad. I think geography makes sense in areas like agriculture where like supply chains really matter, right? I think geography makes a lot of sense with issues like water because like it's geographically based, right?
Yeah.
And these are things we all need. I don't think geography matters as much on stuff like, or should matter as much on stuff like education or even healthcare. Healthcare, it does at the catastrophic end, but on the wellness side, there's so much we can do that doesn't require the one-on-one. So I feel like there's a big divide in how technologies can support some domains and relieve them of the constraint of geography much more easily than other domains.